Hello, my name is Dídac and this is a video class for the course Literatura Inglesa 2, Ilustración, Romanticismo y Época Victoriana. We're going to be looking at Gothic fiction. And these are the topics that I'm going to be covering. First, I will be defining and delimiting the period. We will then move on to the basic theoretical tenets and distinctions. We'll go through characteristic elements of Gothic novels. We will also look at some of the most emblematic Gothic novels, also at Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a special case. Then there is a section I have called Gothic Beyond the Gothic, meaning the influence that the Gothic has after the 18th century. And then we will end with a summary and conclusion. Although the spirit of the Gothic has survived until today, strictly speaking, and in the history of English literature, it spans the last 4 decades of the 18th century. Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, published in 1765, is considered by convention the first Gothic novel. Gothic aesthetics can be considered a reaction against neoclassicism, a movement that had become pervasive and very prescriptive, emphasizing notions like balance, restraint, and decorum. Neoclassicism is also associated with rationalism, which the Gothic rejects in favor of imagination, and more specifically, imagination that is boundless, that has no limits. Fascination with the Middle Ages is also essential to the Gothic. It defines the Gothic, hence its name, which refers to an architectural movement from the late medieval period. As a literary movement, the Gothic harks back to the times previous to rationalism, previous to the Enlightenment, to the great scientific discoveries of the 17th and 18th centuries. Think of Newton, Isaac Newton in England, for example, and also previous to the Protestant Reformation. The emergence of the Gothic also coincides with times of political controversy and upheaval. Times of political controversy in Europe, culminating with the anti-absolutist French Revolution of 1789. Events in France generated debate among English intellectuals, and we could mention Mary Wollstonecraft, William Godwin, who were, as you may know, Mary Shelley's parents, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine. All of these English intellectuals concerned on the French Revolution, some fascinated with it and others concerned or worried that the same might happen in England, that revolutionary ideas might take root in England. In terms of literary evolutions and trends, the Gothic also connects with the poetry of the so-called graveyard school, the graveyard school of poetry, to which poets like Thomas Gray, Edward Young, Robert Blair, and Thomas Purnell belong. Not surprisingly, Thomas Gray, perhaps the most important of these poets, was a fellow student and friend of Horace Walpole. Graveyard poetry is characterized by dark and lonely settings, hence its name, and also by a reflective and melancholy tone. Both graveyard poetry and Gothic fiction can be considered antecedents of Romanticism. Even though the Gothic overlaps with the Romantic era and transcends the 18th century and even the 19th century. The graveyard school of poetry, graveyard poetry and the Gothic and also Romanticism converge in challenging established rules, in choosing distant settings, both temporal and spatial, and also in emphasizing individual subjectivity and powerful imagination. And finally, there is another factor which is economic, and it has to do with the marketing of the novel. And this is the emergence of a mass readership. New readers were not necessarily versed in the classics, and they developed a preference for the sensational in literature, and this contributed to the success of Gothic fiction. Okay, so we now move on to point 2, the basic theoretical tenets and distinctions. Medievalism, as I suggested, is of the essence of Gothic fiction. Especially, the Gothic connects with medieval romance, which had been superseded by the 18th century novel, which was increasingly realistic in its approach to characters and situations. Gothic fiction does not prioritize realism and draws on the imagination, on the improbable instead. The improbable, or the marvelous, we could also call it, is not new. It is not an element introduced by the Gothic. It already existed in English literature, and we may think of ghosts in Shakespeare's plays or Milton's Satan and Hell. What is perhaps new, or more characteristically Gothic, is that the supernatural is experienced individually by a hero or heroine. It is experienced as a test or a threat. A very important notion as well is the notion of the sublime, which informs the philosophical basis or background of the Gothic. The sublime manifests itself in nature and in art as anything that exceeds the human capacity to perceive. It has to do with space, with dimensions, also with anything that produces intimations of transcendence, of the eternal or the timeless. Something that exceeds human power. For example, think of a very high and stiff cliff, for instance, or think of the vast ocean, a building that is very impressive in its size, or a work of art that has the power to arrest thought, feelings, and emotions. All this has to do with the sublime. And of course, fascination with the sublime is also very important during Romanticism, and it is central to the Romantic vision of nature. In his philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, the Irish thinker Edmund Burke famously associates fear and terror with the sublime, and also with premonitions of death. And this is a quote from his essay. No passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear. For fear, being an apprehension of pain or death, it operates in a manner that resembles actual pain. Indeed, terror is in all cases whatsoever, either more openly or latently, the ruling principle of the sublime. And this is the key sentence. So terror is associated by Burke with the timelessness of death, with the artistic creativity and natural superiority of the sublime, and also with the power to hold the subject's attention and control their feelings. All of these positive or attractive qualities. Anne Radcliffe wrote some of the most famous Gothic novels, but she also wrote on the Gothic from a theoretical perspective, like Burke. And she considered the concept of terror. In her essay on the supernatural in poetry, which was published posthumously in 1826, she draws a basic distinction between terror and horror. The former, terror, can elevate the spirit. It is a positive quality and a creative quality. It can make perception more acute, as opposed to horror, which is paralyzing and prevents inspiration from fulfillment and is therefore to be avoided. I also have a quote from Radcliffe. Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. The fictions of Anne Radcliffe and her contemporaries, authors like Clara Reeve or Charlotte Dacre, epitomize what has been called the female Gothic. In their novels, the protagonists most often conform or adapt to the damsel in distress archetype. A young woman assailed by patriarchal dangers or threats such as restrictive authority, forced seclusion, or sexual harassment. Typical in the female Gothic, and especially in Radcliffe's novels, that's one of the essential characteristics of Radcliffe's novels, is that mysteries are rationally explained away at the end, and they are explained or dismissed as figments of the heroine's imagination or the product of her misinterpretation. And this is known as the explained supernatural. These heroines in Radcliffe and in the female Gothic in general are exposed to various external threats, and they normally count on the reader's sympathy. In that respect, we could connect the female Gothic with the sentimental novel or the novel of sensibility, which had been one of the main subgenres of the first half of the 18th century. Think of Samuel Richardson's Pamela or Clarissa, for example. Okay, and we now move on to number 3, and we'll go through the main characteristics, the characteristic elements of Gothic novels. The first one, and this is something I have hinted at already, is the individual psychological experience of the supernatural, which takes the form of various external threats, and we could connect this perhaps with the fear, which I have also mentioned, the fear of the French Revolution, the fear of political chaos in England that might reproduce what was happening in France. We also have, of course, medievalism, fascination with pre-rationalistic times, fascination with obscurantism, with medieval architecture, with the Gothic, with cruel forms of authority, that these writers associated with the Middle Ages. The typical spatial settings are castles, abbeys, convents, dungeons, dark woods, most often in Mediterranean Catholic countries like Italy and Spain. Also important is the religious aspect, and from a Protestant point of view, Catholicism is associated with radical passions, repressive intolerance, and irrational superstition. We also have the element of mystery rooted in the past, which is at the heart of the narrative and is sustained during most of it, creating effects of suspense and surprise. Themes. The most common themes and imaginative concerns have to do with the supernatural, with ghosts, prophecies, a nightmarish portrayal of reality, and also with depravity. And we have violence, we have torture, necrophilia, incest, and so on. And the last one on our list is the exercise of unrestrained, boundless imagination, which is given priority over any kind of moral teaching. And this contrasts with, again, with the English novel of the first half of the 18th century, which was a lot more moral than the Gothic. Good. So now we move on to number 4, most emblematic Gothic novels. I have selected 5 of them. The first one is, of course, the pioneer of the Gothic, The Castle of Otranto, 1764, by Walpole. It introduces some of the basic motifs of Gothic fiction, the motifs that will become typical. A haunted castle as a spatial setting, a melancholy hero, a damsel in distress, all these elements that we have talked about already. And it is prototypically Gothic in combining the imagination of medieval romance with the realism of the new novel. There is also Vathek from 1786 by William Beckford, which is normally included in the Gothic canon because of the diabolical, almost sadistic cruelty of its main character, Caliph Vathek, and also because of the infernal doom that the protagonists meet at the end. Unlike other Gothic novels, this is an Orientalist tale, which it is subtitled, in fact, an Arabian tale, and because of this, it has close connections with Romantic Orientalism and with Byron, who was an admirer of this novel. Next, we have Radcliffe and the Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794. It is set in southern France and again in Italy, and Radcliffe's portrayal of Italy is strongly picturesque and influenced by the work of an Italian painter called Salvator Rosa. And the protagonist of the Mysteries of Udolpho is a young girl, Emily, who is taken to her uncle's castle, to the castle of Udolpho. Her uncle is called Montoni, and in this castle, where she is secluded, she experiences a number of mysterious events, and she is also exposed to her uncle's cruelty and dubious intentions. The Monk is next on our list, 1796, by Matthew Lewis, who was called Matthew Monk Lewis. It is a Faustian tale in which a monk, Ambrosio, sells his soul to the devil. This is a novel set in Spain, actually, in Madrid, and Spain is portrayed as a fanatically Catholic country. Lewis' novel represents Gothic horror. Horror, and this is crucial, horror, not terror. And it is more extreme and suggestive of pure evil. And for this reason, it is normally contrasted with Radcliffe's female Gothic. The Monk was extremely successful, a very successful novel. And finally, we have Melmoth the Wanderer, which was published later in 1820, and in a sense it exceeds the Gothic period stricto sensu, but it is very prototypical as a Gothic novel. It combines some of the basic Gothic ingredients, like a pact with the devil, again, a victim of the Inquisition, incarceration, madness, desperation, suffering, cruelty, all some of the motifs that we have already seen. And we should also, of course, dedicate a bit of time to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is, I have referred to it as a special case in the sense that it is controversial as a Gothic novel. In many ways, it could be considered the culmination of Gothicism, the culmination of the genre. And in her 1831 introduction to the novel, Mary Shelley emphasizes the role of imagination during the process of writing the story. And this is imagination that she describes as overpowering. And this is a quote from this introduction, the 1831 introduction to Frankenstein. "My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie." As we have seen, imagination is essential for Gothic writers, but in this respect it overlaps clearly with Romanticism, and therefore it makes more sense perhaps to consider Frankenstein as a romantic novel with a prominent Gothic component. We must not forget that Shelley's novel was planned in the same place and at the same time as John Polidori's The Vampire, which originated another of the great Gothic myths. I would strongly recommend the reading of the 1831 introduction as well as the novel, as well as Frankenstein. The case for Frankenstein as a Gothic novel, we could look at some of the Gothic elements or episodes in Frankenstein. Frankenstein also sells his soul. He is confronted by a demon in one of the episodes of the novel. He is influenced by, and this is a literal quote, the spirits of the dead. And he, in a very memorable scene, he experiences regret, melancholy regret in a dark cemetery. On the other hand, the novel is very different from some of the fictions that we have talked about. It's very different from some of the typical Gothic narratives. It is, there is no doubt, it is a triumph of the imagination, but it is also a triumph of philosophical and scientific thought. And in this respect, it has little to do with the works of Walpole or Radcliffe or Lewis. On the basis of these considerations, we can think of Frankenstein as an antecedent of science fiction. Okay, and having discussed Frankenstein, we can move on to point 6, which is Gothic beyond the Gothic, by which I mean the influence of the Gothic after the 18th century. We have seen that the Gothic survives during the first half of the 19th century. It is more conventional in Melmoth the Wanderer. It develops into something else, into something different with Frankenstein, and it is parodied in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, published in 1818. And Northanger Abbey is interesting because of its parodic intention, and the protagonist, Catherine Morland, is a quixotic young girl who is strongly influenced by her obsessive reading of Gothic novels. Gothicism will remain a very important element of Victorian literature. From the most popular subgenres like penny dreadfuls, shilling shockers, the very successful Victorian ghost stories, to the great novels of the period. We can think of Miss Havisham in Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. We can think of Bertha Mason in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, or of Catherine's ghost in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. We cannot forget, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was published later, towards the end of the 19th century, in 1897. Other late Victorian novels, like Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, or Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, are also Gothic in many ways, but they stress the psychological aspects of the Gothic. And finally, in America, in 19th century American literature, the Gothic is, of course, epitomized by the work of Edgar Allan Poe. And as I was saying earlier, the Gothic transcends not only the 18th century, but the 19th. And in the 20th century, it has continuities in film and television, and in the work of authors like Stephen King, like Anne Rice. And I'm now coming to my conclusion, summary and conclusion. So the main conclusion should aim at characterizing the Gothic not so much or not only as a specific genre, but as a literary mode that transcends those 4 decades, the last 4 decades of the 18th century, as I said at the beginning. And it also, of course, it transcends English literature. It is a literary mode that has survived until today. And to conclude, I will sum up the aspects covered in this video lecture. We've talked about the historical and cultural circumstances in which the Gothic emerges. We have analyzed some of the key theoretical concepts associated with the genre. We have gone through prototypical elements of Gothic narratives. We have also mentioned some of the key works of the genre, and we have also referred to the continuity of the Gothic, especially in the 19th century. And these are the key concepts or key words that you should try to remember. Medievalism, French Revolution, Graveyard School of Poetry, Pre-Romanticism, the Sublime, Terror, Horror, Female Gothic, and Explained Supernatural. And that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.